Ready, set, lights, camera, action. 10-minute. Okay. D4. We play King's Indian defense. Okay, because I feel like playing my opening, so we play very much King's Indian defense. Okay, D6. Okay, F4. Very interesting. 4 pawns attack. Yes, but okay. Okay, so this is the 4 pawns attack of the King's Indian defense, which is one of the most dangerous lines and one of the most underrated lines for white. It's a line that you'll get absolutely blown off the board with black if you don't know virtually all of the theory. So we begin by castling. And historically, there are 2 moves in this position that I have played throughout my career. One of them is this rare line where black actually goes e5 anyway. Sounds totally absurd, but it's very possible. And we're going to try that here. E5 is a very underestimated sideline that a lot of players don't know. And it throws a lot of players off immediately. Okay, f takes e5, d5. This is, of course, a sacrifice. So white could play knight takes e5. But it's not very advisable to play knight takes e5. Who can tell me why? How do we need to induce weaknesses in white's center, right? Playing a move like rook e8 is not effective because rook e8 doesn't threaten anything. So we need to inflect white's pawn structure. We need to induce weaknesses. The best way to do that is to use our pawns. If we play knight c6, we're just allowing white an out, right? Knight takes c6. So of course we need to play the typical King's Indian move c5. This is where my theoretical knowledge ends, by the way, so now we're on our own. The point of c5 is to get the d4 pawn to move. Why are we getting the d4 pawn to move? Well, what is the d4 pawn defending? It's defending the knight. Why is the knight important? Because the knight is being x-rayed by the bishop. It's in the center of everything. It's vulnerable to rook e8, to knight takes c4, to all sorts of tactics if it's undefended, and that's why we have to make it undefended at all costs. So for those watching on YouTube, we're making an exception doing a 10-minute game for this speedrun episode just because I've got a morning interview and got to go to bed on time. So I'll try to make this worth your while nonetheless. But obviously, I will be playing a little bit faster. My explanations will be a little bit more terse during the game, but we'll still do a post-mortem analysis and hopefully I'll make this worth your while. Yeah, d5. Okay, so d5 is totally reasonable, and here we have a fork in the road. We can, if we want to win the pawn back, take on e4. We can play knight takes e4, knight takes e4, then maybe we can throw in a check on h4, force that knight back, and then recapture the knight on e5 with what seems to be a very nice position. The alternative is to play rook e8 and try to throw the knight off of e5 and develop immediate pressure down the e-file. Both options look very appealing to me. Let's go for the traditional idea. Let's play rook e8. And let's try to develop massive pressure on the e-file before white has had a chance to castle kingside. Thank you, Nemo, for the big raid. And you come at a great time, folks. We are doing a speedrun game. Thank you so much, Nemo. I will be ending soon, but you've caught the tail end of the stream. All right, so we've recaptured on e4. We have this position. What does white want to do on the next move? Well, white wants to castle kingside. And if white castles kingside, it's not the end of the world, but that means we're not, that means our entire strategy of pressuring the e-file has resulted in failure. So we need to try to prevent white from castling at all costs. Now, we can do it without sacrificing anything by using our queen. We can play queen e7, or we can play queen e8. Now, if you're experienced in the King's Indian, you will know that queen e8 is often a better move than queen e7. On e7, the queen is vulnerable to various types of unpleasant moves, like d6, bishop g5 comes with tempo, so there's various shenanigans that affect the queen when it's on e7, and e8 is a very typical square for the queen in the King's Indian. You see this in a wide variety of different lines. So we play queen e8, we prevent white from castling, because if white castles, he loses the bishop. So my guess is something like king f2 is probably white's best bet, but then perhaps we'll develop our light squared bishop to g4. Our dark squared bishop has a nice d4 square that it's aiming at. I wouldn't put the bishop there just yet. There's a knight on f3 that can capture it, but maybe one idea would be to play bishop g4, trade it for the knight, and then establish the other bishop on d4, potentially with check if white's king lands on f2. Knight g5, so our opponent doesn't back down. Knight g5 is a very ambitious move, trying to chase the rook off of the e-file and guarantee the ability to castle. So again, I see two options. One option is to play the move rook to d4, which comes with tempo And then following that, we can play bishop g4. We can also win a pawn. We can play rook takes c4, exploiting the pin. The downside of rook takes c4 is that it allows white to castle. Rook takes c4 castles, then we'll go rook d4. I think in both cases, black is clearly better. Rook d4 is the move that you should play if you want to go for checkmate. Rook takes c4 is the more materialistic option. We're going for checkmate. We're playing very much in the spirit of the King's Indian. I don't know. Perhaps the engine is laughing at me. But we're going to try to go for our opponent's throat here with rook d4. Okay, queen b3. Now, well, if we play bishop g4 prematurely, if we play the move here, white has this unpleasant response, queen b3 to e3, throwing our queen off of e8, and again, the battle revolves around preventing white from castling. I have a cool idea. Bishop g4, we also need to consider bishop e3. So the alternative to bishop g4 is h6, knight f3, and then rook back to e4 to reestablish the pin against the bishop on e2. I think that's a much simpler option. I think it's no frills, right? We just go h6, we chase the knight back, we play rook e4, and then we can develop the bishop to g4. I'll show you guys a little bit of my intuitive calculations after the game. My guess is that bishop g4 is also very, very strong here, but I think h6 is a little bit less calculation required, right? It's more straightforward. So Christopher Reed asks, is a5, a4 any good? Absolutely. If you can combine it with a3, then that puts tremendous pressure on the b2 pawn. Chances are our rook will be out of d4 by that point. So absolutely, a5, a4, a3 is standard fare in these types of positions, but it is a little bit slow, right? It takes, you can say 2 or 3 moves depending on how you look at it. And right now our attention is focused squarely on the e-file, right? The battle revolves around only one thing. It's easy to follow. We want to prevent white from castling. We want to drive white's king out into the center. We want to induce a move like king f2, and then we want to go after the king's throat. That doesn't mean that if white castles, the game is over, we lose, right? Our position is structurally quite sound. So if white castles, it's, you know, the game goes on, which is what's great about this position, right? It's like a battle where only one side can win. If white castles, the game goes on. If we prevent white from castling, then we win. And as I've said many, many times, players in the 2100 range, they tend to panic when they're faced with sustained pressure for 5 moves or more. And this is already a very, very bad move. That was a bad move, bishop e3. Why is it bad? Because it allows black to get 2 pieces for a rook, which in the middle game is absolutely crushing in the majority of cases. This is a panic move. We simply take the knight. And what's ironic about this is that after we take back, we achieve our dream of getting the bishop to d4, and we prevent white from castling. So we've succeeded, and we've gotten a big material advantage. And we can now get our bishop to g4 as we had planned all along. Yeah, now it's time for bishop g4, and notice that b2 is also potentially hanging, but we're not going to go after the b2 pawn. We are going to continue hammering white mercilessly down the e-file until there's nothing left. Yeah, okay, so our opponent is just in total panic mode, just like totally, you know, giving away all their pieces. Yeah, this is not very serious. I think we can just take on e2 with a fork. We can take on e2 with a fork. Okay, queen b7. One more demon to slay. And here I think what the doctor orders is a quiet move, right? Don't panic here with black and say, oh my god, you know, the rook is hanging and now I got to do all this calculation. Just think logically. Okay, if we take white's rook, then white takes our rook, and we want to avoid that scenario. How can we avoid that scenario? Well, we can do so by defending our rook. We can't defend our rook directly, but we can play the simple move, knight d7, to open up a connection between the queen and the rook. Of course, bishop takes rook is also completely winning, maybe even better than knight d7, but knight d7 is the simple approach. And one important detail is that, well, 2 important details. If white plays the move rook e1, you might say, oh, but then I can't take white's rook. We would have had the intermezzo bishop e3 check. Okay, rook takes d4. We can choose which rook we want to take. Let's take this one because this gives us a passed pawn, and this gives us the ability to give a check on e3, which I think is going to simply end the game. There it is. Yeah, our opponent lost his mind. Let's go over the game quickly. So the 4 pawns attack. This game is not exactly a loud advertisement for the 4 pawns. But, dangerous lines like these are double-sided. You have to know how to play them accurately if you want to inflict maximum pain on your opponent. So e5 is a sideline. The main move is c5. The main move is c5. And then if you're familiar with King's Indian theory, you might know that the main line is d5. Black goes e6, sort of Benoni style. Now white plays bishop e2. There is a trade. And you get this sort of Benoni-like position where white has a big center, but it's also an overextended center. So a lot of theory here. There's knight bd7. There's rook e8. There's even the immediate b5 is a move, which is sort of fallen out of fashion. The idea is that bishop takes b5 runs into the very pretty tactic. Knight takes c4, knight takes c4, queen a5 check. Might say, oh, I come back to c3 and defend the bishop. But no, bishop takes c3 and queen takes b5, and black is much better. So a lot of theory here. I won't delve too deeply into it. The move e5 is one of those lines that people tend to not study with white, and we saw that here. So in this position, knight takes e5 is actually a very serious mistake. Accepting this quote-unquote sacrifice is a very bad idea. You could see why. The best move, really the only move, is to play d5. And here white is better. The theoretical assessment of this line is an edge for white. That doesn't mean you can't play it with black. And I have found that these types of positions, a lot of white players struggles. And the move that I have been playing here with black is c5. What does c5 do? Well, what c5 does is it solidifies and dries up the center. And I've pointed out this d6 square. What are we going to put on that square? What is like the very traditional idea? What is the best piece to put on that square? Is it the queen? Who can tell me? It's the knight. It's the king. Yeah, it is the knight. And this is an idea that was hammered into my head when I was around 2100. So don't feel bad if you don't know this. Nimzovich was really the first one to formulate this. This is what's called a blockading square. A blockading square is a square in front of a passed pawn. It doesn't always have to be a passed pawn, but usually. And a blockading square is best occupied by a knight. It's just because the knight, as Nimzovich wrote, can multitask. It can both immobilize the pawn, but because it can jump over other pieces, it's not restricted by the pawn as, for example, a queen would, right? If you put a queen on d6, the queen would just be staring at the pawn. That would be a very good use of resources, but the knight is going to be putting pressure on c4 and e4 while also blockading the pawn. So I remember I had a game in the World Youth under 12, which I ended up winning, but the one game that I lost had a very instructive moment that my coach just excoriated me for. So this was the critical position. You should immediately see the similarity. This was actually a perk, which I used to play at the time. So I correctly understood that the d5 pawn is incredibly annoying. It's sort of hanging over black's position. So I played the move that a lot of people want to play instinctively, which is c6. Like, I want to get rid of the d5 pawn. The problem with the move c6 is that it creates massive weaknesses on the queen. I mean, look at the structure, and very quickly, white just pounced on me and never let go and won the game pretty straightforwardly. What would have been the best move? Yeah, as you guys are already pointing out, very impressive. Knight f6 to e8 is the strongest move, with the idea of rerouting the knight to d6. For example, if white plays h3, I would even conserve the bishop here with bishop d7. Then your idea is to play knight d6. And the byproduct of this is that not only the d5 pawn is blockaded, but also you now have the typical King's Indian idea of pushing f5 and shattering the pawn chain. So knight is the best blockader, and when there's a pawn on d5 like this, you often want to put a knight on d6. Now, in the context of the King's Indian line, this is not all like peaches and cherries. White is better here, and bishop g5 is a very strong move that prevents knight e8. So you can analyze this a little bit on your own. c5 is not the main line. The most popular move is nbd7, bishop d3, and now if I remember correctly, the stockfish recommendation is actually c6 to open up a pathway for the queen to b6. You can analyze this on your own if you're interested. So if you're a King's Indian player, this is definitely a line that you can take under consideration. But I think you should learn c5. If you want to know what to play against the 4 pawns, you should learn c5. And I'll give you a little hint. The best move in this position is actually a very rare move, knight b to d7. This is very rare, but it is now what all of the top GMs play. And the idea is after castles, you play rook e8, and if knight d2, you push c4, sacking the pawn in order to get the c5 square for the knight, and black gets a very big initiative in this line. So this is throwing the 4 pawns into serious question. So e5 takes. White plays knight takes e5. We push c5 in order to shatter the center and weaken the knight. d5 and rook e8, which I can now see is actually the best move. Knight f3. So the alternative was to play knight e4, knight e4. Then perhaps we can throw in a check on h4, forcing the knight back, and then play bishop takes c5. And here I think black is also clearly better. I mean, you could just visually, you can see that white is struggling with development and tons of weaknesses. So this was a completely viable alternative, but rook e8 is even stronger. Knight f3, knight takes c4. Knight e4, rook e4. What's funny is that rook takes e4 is actually an inaccuracy according to the engine. And this is a great example of like the gulf between engine thinking and human thinking. 99.9% of people would take on e4 automatically, but there is an even stronger move. Who can find it? If you're watching on YouTube, pause the video, see if you can find this really funny looking move that's even stronger than rook takes e4. So it's not queen a5 check, although that's an interesting suggestion because of bishop d2. That doesn't yield anything. Okay, so there's 2 main suggestions, f5 and bishop f5. One of them is right. Bishop f5 is wrong because after bishop d3, you're actually helping white castle. Remember, the ultimate goal is to prevent white from castling. The move is to f5. Now you might say, well, but I don't get how this prevents white from castling. White can play bishop e2. White can't play bishop d3 because now you take with a fork. But the thing is, after bishop e2, you take with a pawn, and this pawn is a monster. It's attacking the knight. The knight has no good squares because the f-file is open and white's position collapses. I mean, where's the knight going to go? If the knight drops back to d2, oh my god, the top engine move. Okay, it's no longer the top engine move, but bishop h3 was recommended at one point, which is totally wild. Well, the idea, this is actually I wouldn't say a well-known idea, but it's an idea that I have seen before. You force g takes h3 and you play queen h4 check. Let's see if I can find an example of this IRL. No, yeah, it'll be hard. So I'll save that for another day. But I have seen similar types of ideas. You force g takes h3, queen h4, and now bishop d4 leads to checkmate on f2. The point is that if you play the immediate queen h4, then white has g3. Does that make sense? But the best move here is simply bishop d4 to prevent castling. You are familiar with this move by now. And if knight b3, then you support the bishop with queen f6, threatening a devastating check on f2. And after knight takes d4, c takes d4, just look at these 2 pawns. These 2 pawns are going to tear white apart. You're going to play d3 and e3 and e2, and this game is totally over. So f5 is a fascinating move. I was completely oblivious to it. I wasn't even thinking about it. We took on e4, and of course, black is still better here. There's no question that black is better. But I think that our opponent could have minimized or limited, at the very least, our advantage by tucking the king away on f2, which is a better square than e1. Our opponent tried to solve his problems manually with the move knight g5. The problem is white is just not able to afford a move like this. He's got too few pieces developed, and this gives us the d4 square. So the best move, the best move here was definitely king f2. But you could argue it's a GM move, but you should understand the point of it. You want to play rook e1, and eventually you want to castle by hand, right? I mean, you have to compromise when you're in trouble in these types of situations. We would have probably played bishop g4, which was my idea. And then the line that I was calculating was h3, bishop f3, and now we establish this monster bishop on d4. And we force the king back to f1. King g3 gets mated to queen e5 check. So white has to drop the king back, and okay, the engine gives like a small edge for black. I think in practical terms, white's position is incredibly difficult to handle because everything is disconnected and the king is still weak. So that would be one option. Another option would just be to play the calm developing move knight d7. And the idea of this move is really fascinating. In this position, you can play knight f6, sacrificing the exchange on your own terms. Bishop e4, knight takes c4. Again, you force the king back to f1, closing off the rook And now, bang, you can strike on the queen side. You should be able to tell that white is under tremendous amount of attack here. So lots of options for black, even after king f2. But this would have kept white in the game. Knight g5. Now rook d4. This is better than rook takes c4, I think. Queen b3. And simply h6. I'm confident that bishop g4 was also a very, very powerful move. Perhaps even the best move. Kalakash says, I would never guess any of these moves, but if you're not understanding the intention behind them, then stop me and make me repeat it. Because you should be looking at this and saying, well, these are complicated moves, but I understand why they're being played. The one thing I wanted to show you here, the reason I initially rejected bishop g4 is because of, no, not because of that, because of queen e3. Why is queen e3 annoying? Well, it's actually a very annoying move, because if you trade queens, not only are you taking the foot off the gas pedal, but the rook is literally trapped on d4. Black loses. Now you might say, well, no problem, I'm just going to not trade queens. But if you don't trade queens, then white is now ready to castle kingside. If you play a move like queen d7, then white is ready to castle kingside, and he's solved all his problems. But black has an incredibly powerful move. It's what I would call a GM move. It's not one of those moves that wins you the Brilliancy Prize, but it's the kind of move that wins you the game. Who can find the best move for black? Again, pause the video here if you're watching on YouTube. See if you can spot the best way to keep the tension. Yeah, most of you guys are very close. So it is a knight move. Yeah, knight a6 is very strong. Knight d7 is the best move. Just keep the knight closer to the center. You simply connect the queen and the rook. Why is this move so strong? Because now if white takes the queen himself, or herself, then rook takes e8, attacking the bishop, knight f3, rook d4, and even with the absence of the queens, the bishop is still lost. And a lot of people, they still tend to make the assumption that once or when the queens come off the board, the attack automatically ends. Don't make that assumption. You can checkmate the king with 2 rooks and 3 minor pieces. You can even checkmate the king with basically 1 minor piece. So knight d7 connects the rook and the queen, and black says, I'm happy to trade queens, but you're going to have to give up your bishop on e2 in the process. I could say, well, no problem. Let me just take on g4. And after rook takes g4, let me just castle. Can't do that either because of bishop d4 with a pin. What you can do is take the queen in this position, and while you don't lose the bishop on e2, you lose a million other things. After rook takes c4, black is just tearing white apart. White can't move a muscle without losing another pawn. The rook is coming into c2. This game is over. Does that make sense? So these moves that keep the tension are very important. Of course, knight a6, same exact idea, is, I can see, almost the same evaluation. Why is this a GM move? Well, I think it's not the easiest move to play. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's obvious. I feel like people always struggle with moves that, that keep the tension in this way. But if you found it easy, then more power to you. That's a good thing. All right. Is there something wrong with queen e5? Well, the problem with queen e5 is that you are not putting a rook on the e-file, right? Let's compare this position and this position. Which queen trade is more favorable to black? Well, it's obviously this one, because here there's a rook on e8 to attack the bishop. After queen e5, this bishop on e5 is a dud, and in fact, after bishop e3, we transpose to the line that we were just analyzing where the rook is trapped. We looked at something very similar. It's basically the same as taking the queen, right? This position is virtually the same whether the bishop is on g7 or e5. So it's the right concept to trade on your own terms, but you got to do it in a better way. Now, when I ask you to find the move, it's not always a crazy idea, and you should get into the habit of finding relatively mundane moves, but moves that still win games. Okay, so in any case, let's get back to the game. Queen b3. We played h6, which is, I think, also perfectly fine, and bishop e3 is a terrible move. This loses the game on the spot. Of course, white had to play knight f3. Our opponent panicked when he saw that the rook was coming back to e4. But white carries on. White carries on with queen c2. And after bishop f5, the position is horrendous. But even here, white can play king f2. And there's no clear discover check against the queen. Because remember, rook takes e2, the queen takes on e2, and you're no longer attacking the queen. So that's not valid. I guess black can play a move like b5 or maybe knight a6. Yeah, the eval is like +2. So white should not be able to survive this for very long. But Bishop e3 simply accelerates defeat. At this point, we have a huge material advantage. We have a bishop and the game is over. The rest is easy. Rook f1, bishop g4. Yeah, and okay, giving up a third piece was also unnecessary. But even if white had gone queen c2, we would have played the move knight a6, heading for b4. After a3, drive the queen up to e5, attacking h2, attacking b2, but mainly preparing rook e8 and picking off the bishop on e2. And we win the game in this very simple way. Yeah, after that, everything was easy. Bishop e2, queen b7, knight d7. Last comment, if white would have played rook fe1, what I was saying is that we have this intermediate check on e3 to close the e file so that after king b1, we can simply take the rook. And at best, or at worst, we emerge with 2 extra pieces and a mating attack down the b file. Is rook takes c4 instead of rook d4 viable with the bishop in? Yes, it is viable. I even talked about it, right? If you were listening during the game, I mentioned that this is the more materialistic option, but it tore my heart out to let white castle. Even though this position, I think, is still incredibly good for black. The queen is attacked. If queen c2, we can play bishop f5. So it's largely a matter of taste. And I always choose the line, as you know, that aims for the attack. Another question by Jakes. Was queen e3 possible instead of knight d7? Well, I talked about that. Queen takes e3 is a bad queen trade. Why can't white play rook e1 after bishop e2? Why can't white play rook e1 after bishop e2? Well, of course white can, but it's the same thing. We can give a bishop e3 check, or you can give queen e3 check, forcing the queen trade, and then simply take the rook on d1, and again you're going to be up 2 minor pieces. Devan asks, what if white castles after queen e3, knight d7? Great question. Let's take a look. So this is the line queen e3, knight d7. So this is bishop g4 through knight d7. If white castles here, then you give up the bishop on e2. Notice that the queen is x-ray defending the bishop, right? This is a classic ghost. Like the queen on e3 is almost a ghost, and the queen defends the bishop. So if you castle immediately, you lose the bishop. If you castle here, you lose the queen. And if you take the queen and castle, then again, you lose the bishop. And that's about it, folks. I think I'm going to head out, guys. I'll see everybody later.